Harriet Tubman, Leading Slaves to Freedom, written by Deborah J. Housel. Notice the text feature at the bottom. It says $100 reward for a runaway. And in those days, $100 was a lot of money. We're going to start by going to the back of the book and looking on page 30. It has the glossary and the indexes on page 31. The glossary is like a mini dictionary. If you come across a word that you're not familiar with, if your context clues does not help you understand the meaning, you can always go to the glossary and see if you can find the word. And remember, they're in ABC order, just like a dictionary, and it will tell you the definition of the word. Now the index, if you know a word and you want to look it up in the book to read about it, you can go to the index and find the word, and it will tell you the page number of where you can find the information about that word. So if I wanted to learn about the Underground Railroad, I would look down and find it, and it's towards the bottom of the list, and it is talked about on page 12 and page 20. Now let's go back to the front of the book on page 3. This is where you see the table of contents. It's written like a chapter book, and this is much too short to be an actual chapter book. These are more like sections, and it tells you the different sections and what page you can go to find those sections. So if you wanted to read about Harriet's later years, you would look down the table of contents and find it, and it's on page 26. From Slave to Leader. Harriet Tubman was a brave woman. She was born a slave on a Maryland plantation in about 1820. When Harriet grew up, she ran away. She joined the fight against slavery. She led many slaves to freedom. At the bottom of the page on the left side, the picture shows a young man running, and below it, it says a slave running away from his master. And with slavery, people were actually owned by other people, and the people who owned them were called the masters. And the men or women who were owned were called slaves. On the right-hand side, you can see a picture of Harriet Tubman, a young slave girl. Harriet was one of 11 children. Her family lived in a one-room hut. It had a dirt floor and no windows. At age 5, Harriet worked in the fields. At age 7, she cared for a white baby day and night. At about age 12, Harriet saw a slave running from his master. Runaway slaves were punished. At the bottom on the left side is a family, and it says a slave hut. So this is similar to what Harriet might have lived in with her family. On the right side of the screen, it shows a little child holding a baby, and it says a slave child watches over a sleeping white child while sewing. On the left side of the screen, it shows that slaves were treated badly. He has a whip that he's hitting the slave with. On the right side, it says, to help the man get away, Harriet stepped between him and his master. The angry master threw an iron. It hit Harriet in the head. She almost died. She did not wake up for weeks. When Harriet did wake up, she decided she wanted to be free. And then below that, you see a text box, and it says Harriet's owner, and that's the master of her plantation. Harriet's owner would not spend money on a doctor for her. And at the bottom of the page, it says an old iron weighs more than 7 pounds. Now these are irons that they would use to iron clothes, and they would get them red hot over the fire and then iron clothes with them until they cooled off a little bit and then heated them back up. But they were made out of iron, and they were very heavy. A daring escape. In 1844, Harriet married John Tubman. He was a free African American man. She told him she planned to run away. One night in 1849, she escaped. She took 3 of her brothers with her, but her brothers got too scared. They went back. And below this picture it says slaves hiding at night. So this would be slaves who had already run away and they were hiding from being captured at night. On the right side it says before Harriet married John, her master died. Then she was sold to another master. And below that picture it says men, women, and children waiting to be sold. So this would be a slave auction where they would sell slaves from one person to another. Harriet ran away. She went to a white woman's house. The woman was part of the Underground Railroad. Now notice the Underground Railroad is in bold letters. That tells you that it's probably going to be in your glossary. The Underground Railroad has no tracks. It has no trains. It was made up of people who wanted to help slaves. The people helped runaway slaves travel north to freedom. In the picture at the bottom of the screen, it has a caption that reads, "One stop on the Underground Railroad." On the right side of the page, it says, "Fun fact, Thomas Garrett hid slaves behind a wall in his shoe shop. He helped 2,700 people." And then below it has his name, Thomas Garrett, under his picture. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 let runaway slaves in the North be taken back to slavery. And at the bottom you can see a picture, and it says a group of men being brought back to slavery. At one time, when the slaves would escape to the North, they were free. But then once this Fugitive Slave Act happened in 1850, their masters could always come up and find them and force them back to the South. On the right side of the screen, it says Harriet hid in homes or barns during the day. She walked at night. At last she crossed the Mason-Dixon line. This line was the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland. North of this line was freedom. South of the line was slavery. So look at the map below, and you can see where the white line is and where the free states are and the slave states. And sadly, Texas was one of the slave states. But once they had the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, just because they crossed that line didn't mean they couldn't be brought back into slavery. Leading others to freedom. In Pennsylvania, Harriet met abolitionists. She joined their work against slavery. Harriet saved money. She used the money to go back to the South. She led slaves to the North. She did this 19 times and led more than 300 slaves to freedom. And at the bottom of the page, it shows runaway slaves on their way to freedom. And on the right side, it says, "Fun fact, people called Harriet Moses, like Moses in the Bible. She led people out of slavery." And then the picture shows Frederick Douglass, an American abolitionist. So his job was to help slaves become free. Slave owners knew about Harriet. Posters offered money for her capture, but no one caught her. Harriet made herself look like a man or an old woman. She hid with runaway slaves in the swamps filled with snakes and snapping turtles. Harriet and the runaway slaves were cold and hungry. At the bottom it says a slave hiding in a swamp. On the right side, the caption reads, "A $12,000 reward was offered for Harriet's capture." This was a huge amount at that time. And then below that it says a reward poster for the capture of a runaway slave. Harriet would not let runaway slaves turn back. She knew they would be punished. She also worried that they might tell someone about the Underground Railroad. If a runaway slave wanted to go back, Harriet pointed a gun at the person. She said, "Go on or die." So below that is a picture, and it says Harriet leading slaves to freedom. On the right side it says, "Fun fact, Harriet never fired the gun. She never lost a person to slave catchers." Serving the Union Army. The Civil War began in 1861. The states in the North fought the states in the South. The North wanted to free the slaves. Harriet worked for the Union Army, and that's the Army of the North. She was a nurse and a spy. As a spy, she risked her life to pass secrets to the troops. And below that is a picture, and it says many African Americans, both slave and free, fought for the Union Army. On the right side, you see a picture, and the text box says, Harriet worked for the Union Army for more than 2 years. She was never paid a penny. So she did it because it was so important to her to free the slaves. One night in 1863, Harriet helped lead 150 African American soldiers up a river in South Carolina. In the darkness, they ruined enemy supplies. They freed nearly 800 slaves, and they did it without even one injury. So at the bottom, you can see a picture, and the caption reads, Harriet's mission was a success. Fun fact, all slaves were freed when the Civil War ended in 1865. Harriet's later years. Harriet moved to New York. She gave land to her church to build a poorhouse. Harriet worked for women's rights to vote, too. In 1913, Harriet died. She had risked her life dozens of times, but she lived to be 93. So, fun fact, local Civil War veterans gave Harriet a military funeral. And then at the bottom of the picture, it says Harriet Tubman. And on the right-hand side, it's a monument, and it says Harriet Tubman Monument. It shows her leading other slaves to freedom. Timeline. Now, it's important that you know how to read a timeline. This is a very important text feature. They have the years. In 1820, Harriet Tubman was born on a Maryland plantation. 1833, Harriet nearly dies of a head injury, and notice the arrow pointing to the iron. 1849, Harriet escapes to Pennsylvania and becomes an abolitionist, and it points to her going through the Underground Railroad. 1861, Harriet works as a nurse for the Union Army and frees slaves. In 1863, Harriet spies for the Union Army during the Civil War. And then in 1913, Harriet dies at the age of 93. So always look at a timeline and look at the years of the events, and they should go in order. Here's the glossary and index. You might look over that glossary again and make sure you read the meaning of each word to make sure you understand them. Americans today. In 1987, Oral Lee Brown visited a first grade class. The students were poor. She told them that she would pay for them to go to college. Each year she saved $10,000. Then she started the Oral Lee Brown Foundation. People gave money to help. Almost all of the students in the class finished college. Oral led them out of poverty. So in a way, she was like a modern day Harriet Tubman.